now. All right, so thank you so much for attending today's webinar, where we'll be looking at how people have used art to respond to loss, hope, oppression, and uncertainty. My name is Amanda. I'm the manager of Museum and Holocaust Education at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. And along with me is Shannon, our full-time educator. Just to let you know, I will be asking some of you to respond to things in the chat. So at the bottom, I think it's at the bottom on yours, you'll see the chat feature where you can talk to just us as the panelists or all of the attendees. You can also specifically ask questions and answers throughout. Depending on what they are, I'll either respond to them in the moment, or at the end, Shannon will kind of take care of that and oversee it and let me know what questions I missed. As always, you can find our remote learning resources on our website. If you go under the tab for education, you can find specifically all of our remote learning resources. This week, I was so excited to do this week and really explore how art can be used to access difficult topics. So our major goal for this week for you is to link historical examples with activities or projects that students can work on during this time. So we feel it's really, really important in this time of uncertainty, loss, hardship, oppression, XYZ, that students have an opportunity to process or document their emotions or their surroundings. So feel free to take what you want. I'm going to be incorporating a poll now. I'm trying new things. So you should see a poll in front of you pop up on your screen. If you could please respond to it. Do you use art to explore difficult topics such as the Holocaust with your students? So take a second to answer that. And then if you respond yes, if you could type in the chat, how do you use art to explore? I'm interested to see how, like what age groups you're using it for, what other historical examples or now. So I'll kind of let that go for a minute while you use it. So June, how do you use art with the AP Euro? Is there a specific unit that you use it with? Is it propaganda, things like that? So about half of you said, yes, you do, and about half of you said no. So yes, okay, propaganda. Yeah, we're gonna be creating a whole bunch of stuff next year for propaganda and art. So I like that this was a separate way to use art. Anybody else wanted to share how they use art to access difficult topics? At this time, I'm gonna share my screen with you. You can start. Cool. Paige, love how art has been used to address stereotypes. So we definitely have a resource in here specifically of how portraits can address stereotypes. So hopefully that might be a little bit useful. Before I go in depth, I do want to apologize. I guess I should learn about this, that I guess every Monday the people cut our lawn. So if you hear any of that in the background, my apologies. First and foremost, with this being a week to talk about art, I do want to remind everybody here about our annual art and writing competition. So this year's prompt is to talk about the consequences of hate speech. The prompt is available online on our website, along with some resources to go along with it. Due to school closures, we've had to adjust. So we have 2 different submission deadlines. The writing submissions are due May 15th, so in just about 2.5 weeks, and the art submissions are due May 30th. Art submissions this year are going to take place via Dropbox. So you can have your students take photos of their artwork and they can upload it to Dropbox. If your students do not have internet access, they can still mail their art submission to the museum, and then Shannon or myself will take a photograph of the art and upload it to Dropbox, because our judges are only going to be seeing photographs of the artwork. Writing submissions as well, you can email them to us, or if your students do not have access to a computer, they can handwrite and handwrite and mail in their submissions. So we encourage all of your students to participate. We're still figuring out what the prize will be given the current situation, but I think it's a really great opportunity for students to connect history in a more artistic expression. All right, so we have our 2 essential questions that we are exploring this week. Why is it important to consider both the written record and the artistic expression to understand any period in history? And how do different forms of self-expression communicate different information, observations, and feelings? So when I think about art, I often think about visual art, and it's only after I sit for a minute that I'm think about poetry as art, or music or dance as art as well. And so how do all of these different types of art help us understand the history that we're understanding, or that we are researching and teaching? And then how does that information come across differently? How does it help us give a different perspective? So today we're going over quite a bit. We're going to go over 3 examples of visual art, 2 from poetry, and 1 from music and dance. Again, and if you have any questions throughout, or you wanted to chat something, please feel free to do so. The Heinrich Ross, if you came to our museum last fall, we had Heinrich Ross's exhibition. So this is a workshop that we have available at the museum, and we've adapted it for remote learning. So without further ado, I will start with that. In the remote learning resource that we created for this, usually with this workshop, how it works is we set up 6 different tables, and we have a group of photos on the different tables. We have students do like a big paper activity where they walk around, and they're given 2 minutes at each table to analyze the photos and kind of like reflect on them and answer other students' reflections and things like that. So it's really, really interactive. And so we have adapted that slightly. In the beginning, we do typically start off to talk about Heinrich Ross. In the remote resource, we have a short video clip that encompasses that. So it's a really, really great introduction to Heinrich Ross and the Lodz Ghetto. So for those of you who don't know, Heinrich Ross was in the Lodz Ghetto from 1940 to 1944. The Lodz Ghetto is the 2nd largest ghetto and the longest lasting ghetto. Heinrich Ross was appointed to the Department of Statistics to take photographs within the ghetto. His main role within the photographs was to take photographs for work IDs of official events and things like of that nature. He did, however, also secretly take thousands and thousands of photographs of life within the ghetto. So his photos really allow us to understand a different part of the ghetto. This is typically where I start to teach students how to analyze photos. So in the chat right now, what I would like you to do is take a look at this photo, and you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, there are some questions for you to answer. Pick one of those questions and in the chat answer them. Oops. So some of the questions that we're going to be answering is what is happening in this photograph, what captures your attention, and why. Those first two questions really allow students to not get into analyze yet, but just start to recognize and identify things in the photograph. So sometimes we ask students to analyze and they don't necessarily know how, or they jump to conclusions without sitting and just taking the photo in for a minute and really just seeing what is in front of them. So Paige said, my attention is drawn to the star on the back of the child's coat. Once students get to actually just sit and look at the photograph for a second and sometimes notice minute details, after that is when we'll ask them to really interpret more of the photo. So what meaning is this photo intending? How is Ross communicating his message? And what is the purpose of this photograph? Maya is saying, he seems to be wanting us to see that there is a clear difference longing between the people on the other side. June, the fact that they are children reaching towards someone who seems important to them. And the star is a quick reference point for students, and the face demonstrates that there is a clear barrier. So these are all things that you first want students thinking about. And in the remote learning resource, I have gone through all of the answers on this. So when we are thinking about what's happening in this photograph, we can identify that there is a boy yelling, wearing a star, that there's a fence, people are separated. So just observations. There's children, there are people on the other side. What captures your attention? For me, it's the grasping of the hand on that fence. Actually, both of those hands, just like kind of gripping for, is this really happening to me? Wondering, what are they talking about or thinking about? What might this message be? Is it this feeling of hopelessness, helplessness, sadness of family separation, unknowing, uncertainty, being scared? How does Ross communicate that message? And this is one thing that, depending on your students, they may or may not get, but it's good for them to be pushed and challenged, is if you look at the angle of the photo, it's definitely taken from a little bit lower, as if Ross is kind of taking it from a child's perspective and not necessarily straight on. So we can see that, again, the grasping of the fence, the hand over the other person's face. So it's like this message of the unknown. And so with the interpretation, it's our own interpretation. It's not necessarily what Ross intended us to believe. And that's one of the beautiful things about art, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be what the artist intended. It could be how you interpret it, and that's it. What was the point of this photo was to document the deportation from the Jewish perspective. We have so many photographs of deportation from the Nazi lens. And so Ross's work lets us see the Holocaust through a Jewish lens and a Jewish perspective. And so I think that the audience for this is the world, so that they could see the truth of how deportation affected the Jewish people. So there are no wrong answers in this. It is all what your students can bring to the table. What would happen next, and how it can be adapted, I'll go over a little bit later on, but we've grouped the photos in certain ways so that there are themes. So in the remote learning resource, you can have your students analyze all of the groups. You can have them analyze one photo from each of the groups. It is totally up to you and how you feel it will best serve your students. I'll go over some more adaptations at the end, but I do want to just go over how we've structured this workshop for students at the museum. So this first theme is destruction. And when we look at the 4 photographs, they all show different parts of destruction. And so if you look at the top right with the child, this is the one that really throws most people off. So Heinrich Ross's photographs, he ended up burying about 6,000 of his photos towards the end of the war in August of 1944, when the Lodz ghetto was being liquidated. And so at the end of the war, he did survive, and he unearthed his photos, and about 3,000 of them survived, many of them with water damage. So this top right photo really shows to us how not only lives were damaged, but that the actual documentation was damaged as well. You have the destruction of the synagogue in the area, the rubble of the community, people trying to clean up after destruction. So this is kind of, you can have students, again, analyze one photo, analyze all of them together as a theme, but making them think about or just look closer at what do these images share. And you can have them answer all of the questions from the previous slide, from this one. This theme is propaganda. So June, this would be a really interesting one for you to include. Heinrich Ross had to take official photos. And so when we look at these photos, they are phenomenal. They are so beautiful. And they were used to show the world, it's not so bad. Look, they're working, it's clean, it's safe. They're happy. If you even look at the woman, it looks like she has a slight smile. And so these are all propaganda photos. And when we talk about this and debrief these at the museum, we contrast them with these. So these are work photos. These are the photos of Jews being forced to bring their sewing machines in. This is the bottom right is a photo of people waiting outside trying to get work. The top left, a photo of Jews actually working in the conditions that they had to work in. So when you, again, compare the propaganda to reality, you can see this was intended for Nazi use. This was intended for the world to understand the reality of what was happening. This next set of photos is all about deportation. And if you look at each one of these, you can see each one of them shows a different stage of deportation. And some of them stages that we don't often consider or talk about. So if you have the top left one, these are people in Lodz sorting through the people's belongings who were deported. And that is not a part of deportation that we think about, is how does it affect the people who are left behind? And so that's out of all of Ross's photographs, this top left one is the one that, you know, really stands out to me the most personally, because it just captures a piece of the Jewish experience that is never talked about or never really documented. And so I really, really appreciate that one. You have the one of the children being deported, and you can notice in that photo, there are no parents around. And so we can talk about resettlement and how deportation was framed as resettlement, and how these people had no idea necessarily where their children were going, but maybe thinking that they were safe. So that's something interesting, that when you have students just sit and observe, what do you see in this photograph? I see children. What do you not see in this photograph? I don't see parents. At the bottom right, this is a photo of the deportation at the rail cars. And so this is the last deportation out of Lodz, and Ross is actually hiding in this photo. You can't necessarily see it by the way that this one is framed, but he is hidden and snapping these photos. These are the only photos taken outside of the actual Lodz ghetto, and instead at the railway station. And again, you see deportation at the rail cars from the Nazi perspective. Here you can see the Jewish perspective of how somebody's hiding taking this photo. These ones also particularly touch me because this theme is individuals. And when you look at the lady on the left with the 3 hats on her head, she clearly has no idea where she's going. And so again, maybe she thinks she's being resettled. It looks like she's wearing 2 or 3 coats. But then you have this young girl in the middle who's smiling. And Ross really makes us remember that the Holocaust affected individuals. It wasn't just a group of people, it was individual stories compiled together. So you have on the right, you have one of the Jewish police officers within Lodz as well. So just having us realize each and every person has a story within the Lodz ghetto, and these are just some people that he sought to capture. And then finally, this last theme we thought about as hope, and these photographs are ones that really complicate our understanding of life in a ghetto. And so when we close our eyes and think about how we see a ghetto, it's often death, despair, danger, it's dirty. And these photos are nothing of that. It is a group of friends celebrating and having some wine together. It's kids playing a game. It's possibly a mother and a child trying to retain as much normalcy as possible. And this isn't meant to say that ghettos were a place of fun, far from it, but ghettos are a place of resilience as well, and how people strive to create normalcy in the most oppressive situations is something that we also have to recognize as well. So I think some of these photographs really put into perspective how Jews experience the ghetto, not just as victims, but as people who tried to retain their sense of humanity. And so in the remote learning resource, we kind of conclude with asking students to respond to these 2 questions. How do you think Ross's photos help us better understand the Holocaust, and more specifically, the Lodz ghetto? And how did Ross use photography as a tool of resistance? And how can photos be used to resist today? So as you're thinking about how to adapt this with your students, if you need to do it remotely and it's independent learning, then again, the resource is already created for you to have students choose one photo, choose all photos. If you can have them, if you can share it as a Google Doc, you can have them, you can ask students to respond to each photo with either an analysis or a response to one of their other students using the comment features on Google Docs. You can use the jigsaw as well. So if you are meeting live with your students, you can do your Zoom rooms and separate each one of these groups. So I think there are 5 groups into with your students, and then have them analyze and report back. And then an extension project. So this is where we can bring it to students today. Every single one of your, I'm not going to say every single one, I take that back. A lot of your students are going to have phones with cameras on it. They don't realize how much power they have in their hands. And so challenging your students during this time to use the cameras on their phones to document life around them. Add some captions, create an album, and write an artist's manifesto, documenting this time. Every single one of us is a historian in this moment. And what are we doing to capture that for future generations? So I think that's a really fun project, is they all use their phones. Great, now let's make it this really awesome project. Additionally, you can have students think about photos throughout history that they feel are really important to understanding history. So is there some photo that stands out to them that they're like, yes, this photo needed to happen to make us better understand what was going on during that time? Or Conversely, are there photos missing from history? What perspectives aren't documented through photos that they wish that they saw? So having them choose something of their own and write a paragraph or one page on photos that they see throughout history or what's missing. So that's how we use that resource. I'm going to move on to what is a portrait. So if we look on the left, this is a picture of Frederick Douglass. So this activity is geared towards educators in 3rd through 8th grade, but that doesn't mean that you can't adapt it for high school. And so when we're looking at photographs, we're really thinking about how a snapshot of a person, like how do portraits capture the complexity of a person? It's really, really hard. Portraits are literally just a snapshot. So how do we get this entire person's story, their essence, into one photo? And so it really makes us think about the power that portraits have to share a story, but also what happens when portraits misrepresent a person or a people. How do portraits shape our understanding of people? And so again, on the left, there is one of the resources that we have. It's called What is a Portrait? And it's by Teaching Tolerance. And you have students look at portraits of famous Black Americans and how those portraits either reinforce or challenge stereotypes. So it's a really, really accessible activity for students to do, just to get them thinking about portraits and what power they have. On the right, you have a portrait of Bella and Roslyn. And so there is an artist named David Kassan, and he interviews people. So this is a project out of the USC Shoah Foundation and is currently being exhibited at the USC Fisher Museum of Art. And so David Kassan interviews Holocaust survivors and then draws their portraits. And so it is a fully formed lesson. This one is definitely geared towards students in, I'm going to say probably 7 through 12, maybe 9 through 12. And you can go look at 3 portraits. There are some questions for them to think about. And then there's this amazing activity where students are asked to interview somebody in their life and then draw a portrait of them. So challenging them to see how difficult portraiture is. And again, how do you choose what part of somebody's history do you capture in that picture? What colors are you using to convey this certain message? If I look at the faces on all of these people, you can see on the 2 women how serious they look, and you can tell that there's something in their history that makes them almost hard. And Frederick Douglass is dressed impeccably. So how is he challenging this stereotype? Again, he has this very serious face. So how is he challenging that stereotype of Black Americans during that time period and even today? So depending on what age group you have, you can definitely have them analyze portraits and then choose to draw a self-portrait or interview somebody else and draw their portrait. Next, we have story cloths, and this one was so much fun to learn about how this one Holocaust survivor, Esther Krinitz, had decided to use art to convey her story from beginning to end, not just about the Holocaust, but her entire life story. So you can see the background picture that's kind of a little dulled is life before the Holocaust. It's just how she grew up. Then the top right here is when the Nazis came. This middle one is about her at the work camp, at the concentration camp. And this last one here is her coming to the US post-war. And then she continues to make these story cloths after the war, just kind of telling different parts of her life. And so in this activity, you have students explore her online gallery, some of which have audio clips of her or her daughters speaking about the photos. And so this one's geared definitely more towards 5 through 12, but upper elementary still. And so after looking at Esther's story cloths, having your students create their own story cloths with an artist statement explaining which colors they use, which materials were available to them that they decided to incorporate. And if you have the availability, you can have students submit the photos to you, and then you can create an online classroom gallery. And so before we move on from visual art, I do just want to remind everybody that we have to recognize that not all students have access to every single art material out there at this time, but do encourage your students to be really creative. How can they use things in nature? How can they use household products? How can they use, I don't know, I'm trying to think, oh, I was taking apart furniture the other day and I had like washers in my hand and I was like, oh, these would have been great for an art project. So just looking at the tiniest little things that people can use to create this art. And I almost think that is what would make this art even more special, is given the circumstances, what students used to create the art, how they were so creative in coming up with things to get their perspectives and their points across. So we hope you found at least one form of visual art that you can use with your students, and hopefully some fun activities that they can do during this time to kind of process and document and share what they're feeling. Next, we're going to move on to poetry. And so I am not the strongest poet, but I can definitely appreciate poetry. And there's different ways throughout my teaching experience that I've found that I can engage with poetry. I am definitely not necessarily a type of person who's that creative that can just write a poem and be like, great, this is really creative, I'm coming out with it. But I love found poetry. So going through newspapers, through magazines, cutting out phrases and finding the words that you are thinking about. You can use blackout poetry. So again, you take an article, you take a page from a book, something like that, and you black out the words until your poetry comes to life based off of the words that are on that page. You can find a poem that's already out there and illustrate what it's saying and how that poem speaks to you. Or you can use spoken poetry, either your own or somebody else's, and actually bring to life what those words mean. Because every person is going to say a poem differently, and how you say it can really get your message across and almost like give you this, what's the word I'm looking for? Like meditative quality of being like, yes, that's how I feel, and I just got it out of my system. Just some other types of poetry. You can do haikus, limerick, acrostics. There's a lot of different types of poetry, not just rhyming or things like that. So the two types of activities I'd like to highlight is the power of poetry. This one is an amazing, it's like 4 activities, but which can be kind of combined down for it's a total of 60 minutes, and you can choose which ones fit your class schedule. So the first activity is to read a poem and kind of break down that poem, and then watch an actress read that poem and discuss how reading something changes how you understand the poem or changes the impact of the poem. Then you can have students analyze up to 5 poems about different about different experiences. So it could be the Holocaust. There's one about the Rwandan genocide. I believe there's one about the Armenian genocide. There's one about bystanders. So there's different histories in there. So students can analyze those poems, and there are teacher notes included, so that's really helpful for you. And then you have students perform those poems and bring those poems to life. So kind of using that spoken poetry, but they don't have to create the poems themselves. They're just speaking how that poem really reflects with them. Then there's Poetry 180, where it is a collection of poems, and you can have students choose to look through the poems and pick a poem that resonates with them at this moment, and have them illustrate that poem. So again, if you have students that aren't creatively inclined to write what they're feeling, they can choose somebody else's words that you're like, yeah, that's how I'm feeling, and they said it really well. But also challenging students to reflect and say, how did they feel when they read that poem? What new words or phrases did that poem offer them to help them express their feelings? And I want to thank you all for being on here, because you get to know that I did add 2 more collections this morning. I got an email from Teaching Tolerance about poems of people who were resisting and feeling empowered, and poems throughout the civil rights movement. So I added those to the document this morning. So those are just a few ways that poetry can be used in your classroom to either access difficult histories or to have students find ways to express themselves. And then finally, music and dance. And so this is a really, really fun way for students to learn how this woman, Dorothy, there's a short video clip and a New York Times article available on the remote learning resources. And students are prompted to reflect on how does dance add or enhance the telling of a history. And so this woman, Dorothy, takes testimonies from Rwandan survivors and creates a dance out of them. And so how does the movement of bodies add to just listening to somebody's story and getting them to think about that? So the activity that we have for students is, I'm sure we all have heard of TikTok by now. And so we figured, you know, don't fight it and just hop along with it. So we thought about, you know, what if students created a TikTok about their pandemic experience and writing an artist statement that provides context or insight into the dance. So we know a lot of them are using TikTok for other measures, but how can we use it to kind of reflect on the experiences that we are having right now? So those are just some of the resources that we have highlighted from this week. If you have any questions or you want me to expand a little bit more on any of them, feel free to put in the question and answer or the chat. I'm going to stop recording now so I can just kind of respond to everybody here, but thank you so much for coming. There is, after you log off, there is you should receive a pop-up that prompts you to our survey. And so if you could fill out that survey, after you fill that out, I will send you your PDU via email. But other than that, thank you for joining. Next week's webinar is next Monday at 2 p.m. So again, trying some different times. And we will be going over memorials and how they help shape our narratives. So thank you.